Welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module called Anomie and Suicide of Durkheim, which comes under the paper called Classical Sociological Tradition. What is suicide? Is it something which is psychological, or is it something which is a social fact? Now, according to Durkheim, suicide is a social fact that occurs due to coercive external forces and wherein the individual does not have much agency to counter it. And this collective external coercive force is nothing but the collective consciousness of society. Now, why does an individual go to the extent of committing suicide? And according to Durkheim, in modernity, there is a sense of normlessness which he calls as anomie. This anomie, he says, leads to suicide, which is a social fact. And he has tried to show how there are various rates of suicide amongst different societies and nations in the world, but especially so amongst Christianity in France. The period that Durkheim wrote and worked extensively on comprehending social phenomena was a phase when human history had recently transited into modernity. The Industrial Revolution, together with the market logic and urbanization, led to mass migration of people from the remote corners of the country to cities. Cities became the new home to this unceasing flow of migrants, predominantly the poor, landless laborers from the countryside. In such a context, cities displayed signs of breakdown. Slums, poverty, and crime were the most outstanding features of any Western European nation. This was an era when society was losing faith in established forms of religion and normative order. This new scenario meant that new forms of network had to be established, new relationships needed to be forged, and most importantly, migration to cities also meant an isolated, impersonal life that could force individuals into restricted sociabilities. In his work, Durkheim had shown how normlessness could lead to a situation wherein the individual felt unwanted by the system itself being a self-sustaining, automatic, bureaucratic, and an impersonal machinery. For the system, the individual was not important, but the assigned role was important. In such objectified roles and under tremendous duress of work, individuals began to take the extreme step of committing suicide. However, those individuals who took this extreme step were deemed to have had history of psychotic disorder, or were weak when, who lacked the courage as others. It was also observed by Durkheim that the actual rate of suicide was lower for individuals who belonged to the Catholic sect as compared to the Protestant sect within Christianity. This led him to question some of the commonsensical propositions such as biological or family history of psychological disorder. He proposed to go a step further by assessing the reasons for why individuals felt alienated in the first place. This meant that he had to ask questions that questioned the erstwhile understanding of societal functioning. It became quite clear to him that suicide rates amongst the Catholics was lower because the individuals were insulated from the outside, harsher world by a very active community life that included get-togethers, festivals, regular visits to the church, and control of the church, extended family support among such other reasons. The very basis of Protestantism was to actively prove that one was the chosen one by God, and hence most individuals were workaholics who had little time for social gatherings and societal functions. In such a situation, according to Durkheim, individuals became further individuated until they had to find mental and spiritual comfort in contractual relationships. Many of these individuals also believed in the virtue of the utilitarian principle of capitalism, that is, maximization of profit. This meant constant hard work and stiff competition between fellow workers, leading to further alienation. This module will attempt to examine how the so-called individual perceptions, cognition, and actions are in many ways a manifestation of societal processes that are sometimes visible and most times invisible. Thus, individual action is part of a social repertoire that has been given to the individual through the process of socialization. Suicide, therefore, is a social fact which is a coercive external force that acts upon the individual without choice. The range of Emile Durkheim's analysis of the interconnectedness of suicide with social and natural phenomena is wide and varied as to preclude treatment of all its avenues and by roads in the short space of this introduction. Within the confines of one not over long volume, Durkheim has treated or touched on normal and abnormal psychology, social psychology, anthropology, meteorological and other cosmic factors, religion, marriage, the family, divorce, primitive rights and customs, social and economic crisis, crime and law and jurisprudence, history, education and occupational groups. A short appraisal is still possible because throughout Durkheim's work on each and all of these topics subsidiary to suicide is the basic theme that suicide, which appears to be a phenomena relating to individual, is actually explicable etiologically with references to the social structure and its ramifying functions. The early part of Durkheim's work was devoted to the questioning of and negation of doctrines and theories that ascribe suicide to personal, biological and extrasocial factors such as mental illness, schizophrenic personality and abnormal personalities. Durkheim's work involved the processes of elimination of all theses that resorted to individual or other extrasocial causes for suicide. This is used as a foundation for reaffirming his theses, stated in his introduction that the suicide rate is a phenomena sui generis, that is, the totality of suicide in a society is a separate, distinct and capable of study in its own terms kind of a social phenomena. Since, according to Durkheim, suicide cannot be explained by its individual forms, and since the suicide rate is for him a distinct phenomena in its own right, he proceeds to relate currents of suicide to social structures and social processes. It is these social concomitants of suicide which for Durkheim will serve to place any individual suicide in its proper etiological setting. Social changes in Europe and suicide. According to Giddens, Durkheim's study of suicide is one of the classical sociological studies to explore the relationship between the individual and society. Even though humans see themselves as individuals exercising free will and choice, their behaviors are often socially patterned and shaped. Durkheim, through his study, showed that even a highly personal act like suicide is influenced by the social world. In examining official suicide reports in France, Durkheim found that certain categories of people were more likely to commit suicide than others. He discovered, for example, that there were more suicide rates among men than women, among Protestants as opposed to Catholics, among the wealthy compared to the poor, and among single over married people. Durkheim also noted that suicide rates tended to be lower during times of war and higher during times of economic changes or instability. In broad historical terms, there are a number of reasons why Durkheim took up the theme of suicide. When he first did, suicide was a growing social problem in Europe by 1850, and many felt that it was associated with the development of industrial society. Industrialization had advanced individualism, accelerated social fragmentation, and weakened the social bonds tying individuals to society. Second, industrial society had made economic institutions dominant over other social institutions, and this served to place individual self-interest and economic gain over the collective forces of society. As individual autonomy and political freedoms increased, the individuals became the center of social life, and this served to reduce the level of social restraint and to call into question the nature of collective social purposes. Third, the political crisis of the Dreyfus affair in 1894 was a serious blow to French national unity and drew attention to how much social fragmentation and egoistic forces had replaced the collective authority of society. This led Durkheim to believe that the theme of social dissolution brought about by industrial society could be examined sociologically by looking at the mechanisms in society which link individuals to social purposes outside themselves. Fourth, factual evidence made available by comparative morality data from different societies linked suicide to social factors such as industrial change, occupation, family life, and religion, and this served to focus attention on society and social institutions rather than on complex psychological factors. Durkheim found that the statistical data contained in the records of suicidal deaths for the period could be categorized according to age, religion, sex, occupation, military service, and marital status, and this led directly to a search for the role played by social factors in the cause of suicide. Suicide as a social fact. In the rules of sociological method, Durkheim examines a category of human facts which present very special characteristics. They consist of manners of acting, thinking, and feeling external to the individual, which are invested with a coercive power by virtue of which they exercise control over him. Such circumstances he deems social facts. These consist of representations and actions and not purely organic or psychical phenomena. Durkheim employs this characterization of social facts in the rules to demonstrate that individuals are social beings, inextricably woven into the fabric of social processes. He begins from the premise that one cannot understand individual behavior without understanding the social forces acting upon the individual. He also notes that an understanding of the fundamentally social nature of humanity will help allow the field of sociology to undergo the necessary process of passing from the subjective stage to the objective stage. Durkheim demonstrates the coercive influence of social organization on our morality and behavior, both by describing what we are born into and by describing what an individual will face if he or she tries to resist. We are born into families, and perhaps religions and our families and religious leaders teach us what to believe and what to think about right and wrong. We are given language, which is our only means of communication, and we are constrained in every respect by the organization of laws, rules, and customs of societies in which we live. The individual who tries to communicate without language will be unable to do so. The individual who tries to behave outside of the norms established by laws and customs will be punished. And the individual whose moral compass does not reflect the public conscience, as Durkheim calls it, will either be punished by the law or suffer social isolation. If an individual is raised in a religion, resistance against the doctrines of that religion will result in the forms of punishment as well. Social facts regulate human social action and act as constraints over individual behavior and action. They may be enforced with law, with clearly defined penalties associated with violation of sentiments and values of the group. Sanctions may be associated with social facts. For example, as in religion, where resistance may result in disapproval from others or from spiritual leaders, individuals may be unaware of social facts and generally accept them. In this case, individuals may accept the values and codes of society and accept them as their own. Durkheim's attempt to provide an empirical study of suicide must be measured against the criteria that he sets out in rules. Durkheim's goal in establishing a social methodology was twofold. First, he wanted the sociology to be more scientific and move from the realm of subjectivity to objectivity. And second, he wanted to prove the primacy of social fact. For Durkheim, social facts must be treated as things and not as personal experiences, but also be observed by a researcher. Durkheim states that in the past we analyzed and combined our ideas with our observations and comparisons. These social facts, however, possess resistance, meaning that they cannot be molded to satisfy any specific situation, but will remain independent of the researcher, the individual, and to an extent the situation, even though these facts are born of the summation of individual experiences. Types of suicide. Durkheim's study of suicide is divided into two explanatory sections. In the first, Durkheim explains suicide by drawing on the concept of social integration, referring to the strength of the social bonds existing between the individual and society. In this case, egoistic and altruistic suicide form opposite poles of social integration. In the second part of the theory, Durkheim explained suicide by drawing on the concept of social regulation. Social regulation, in contrast to integration, refers to restraints imposed by society on individual needs and wants, and generally manifests itself through regulatory requirements that are imposed by society on individuals when their social needs and wants begin to exceed the means they have for attaining them. In the case of social regulation, anomic and fatalistic suicide form opposite poles in relation to changes in the regulatory functions of industrial society that may lead to shifts in the suicide rates. Egoistic suicide. The term egoism originates from the 19th century and was widely used by Durkheim and others to indicate the breakdown of social ties that came with the development of industrial society and the pursuit of private interest. Egoism can best be described as the process by which individuals detach themselves from the wider society by turning their activity inward and by retreating into themselves. Egoism is characterized by excessive self-reflection and on personal matters and a withdrawal from the outside world. In this state, according to Durkheim, the springs of action are relaxed and individuals turn inward and towards themselves and away from the society. Egoism, according to Durkheim, results from too much individualism and from the weakening of the social fabric. Simply stated, egoistic suicides result from absence of social integration and a weakening of bonds which attach individuals to the groups outside themselves. This occurs when the integrative mechanisms attaching individuals to the family, religious and political group form gaps in the links connecting individuals to society, so that individuals retreat to themselves. In such circumstances, individuals rely more on themselves and less on society, and as a result they withdraw their allegiance from collective life. As social integration declines, the gaps emerging between the individual and institutional points of contact become wider, and as a result individuals are less drawn together. Durkheim thought that individuals by nature cannot live without attachment to some social groups which transcends them. Egoism thus attacks social bonds in at least two fundamental ways. First, by eroding the common bond linking the individual to society. Egoism makes private life a dominant aim, and this acts to defeat collective purposes and attachments. Second, egoism promotes withdrawal from everything external to the individual, and when this occurs, society allows the individual to escape its hold. As a consequence, when individual becomes detached from society, they encounter less resistance to suicide. Here, therefore, the bond attaching individuals to life relaxes because the bond attaching them to society is slack. Altruistic suicide. This is considered to be the polar opposite of egoistic suicide. Durkheim began his discussion by citing the suicide of tribal societies where rather than die of old age, individuals kill themselves to maintain their dignity. By contrast, in the other societies, there are customs which dictate that dying a natural death leads to an afterlife which is full of pain and suffering. In still other societies, it is believed that old men must throw themselves off a mountain when they are tired of life. In all these cases, those who take their own life are honored and their families spared humiliation, while those who fail to do so are denied the honor of a funeral, and a life of dishonor and pain is presumed to await them. This differs from the egoistic suicide in that it results from too much social integration rather than too little. Under this category, Durkheim lists three specific types of suicide. First, the suicide of older men threatened with severe illness. Second, suicide of women on the deathbed of their husbands. Third, suicide of followers on the deaths of their chiefs. Under these circumstances, people take their own lives, not because of the personal right to do so, but because of a social duty that is imposed upon them by society. This duty is so strong that when individuals avoid their obligation to take their own life, they risk being socially disgraced or religiously sanctioned. When the duty is carried out, society confers social honor upon them, which is thought to extend after life. Altruistic suicide is the clearest case of social type of suicide, because suicide is imposed externally on the individual as a social duty and is the result of social rather than personal ends. Since in these societies, people take their own lives because their attachments to the group far exceed their loyalties they have to themselves. As individuals live in close proximity to one another, the social customs and beliefs tend to be unified to the point that the social attachments increase. As a result, collective supervision and social surveillance extend throughout society, leading to the similarities in beliefs and social observances. Under such circumstances, the individual has no private life, and that is immune from collective surveillance. There is little independence from group life, and individual existence by itself has no meaning. The altruistic looks to a goal beyond this world and believes this world to be an obstacle and burden to him. The altruistic suicide springs from hope and faith. Contemporary sociologists have used this analysis to explain kamikaze pilots, the cult of the suicide bombers, people who saw the social world as meaningless and would sacrifice themselves for greater ideal. Anomic suicide. The term anomie was first coined by Durkheim in the Division of Labor in 1893, but it was not until 1897 that he began to use the term in a more narrow sense to describe the overall deterioration of the levels of restraint in society. Anomie is used by Durkheim to refer to the decline that takes place in the regulatory functions of society and social institutions during industrial development, when the capacity of society to set level of social restraint begins to weaken. The regulatory functions of the society serve the purpose of imposing restraints and setting limits on individual needs and wants. To be clear on this point, Durkheim made a distinction between two kinds of regulatory functions, between bodily needs and social needs. Bodily needs and wants such as hunger or sleep, according to his thought, were self-regulating. In this context, body's limit on need and appetite is governed by biological limitations, which cannot as a rule operate outside set boundaries. In case of social needs and wants, however, the situation is completely different. He pointed out that social wants such as appetite for wealth, prestige and power are essentially unlimited. There is no natural limitation, and more an individual obtains, the better. Durkheim believed that the causes of deregulation can be traced to two basic sources. First, the development of industrial society and private competition, and second, the dominance of economy over other social institutions. Using this perspective, anomie can be defined as a state which results from the decline in the regulatory mechanisms of society brought about by unchecked economic progress. Fatalistic suicide. This is the last category of suicide listed by Durkheim, and it represents the opposite pole of suicide resulting from adjustments in a regulatory mechanism of society. Fatalism, according to Durkheim, signifies a form of suicide which occurs because an excess of social regulation as opposed to anomie, which signifies an absence of regulation. Fatalistic suicide occurs as a result of an overly developed system of control over the individual. To explain the case of fatalistic suicide, Durkheim cited an example of slaves who, seeking no alternative to life except enslavement under a master, take their own life. By 1897, Durkheim's study was published, and there were a number of European and American scholars who believed that suicide was a psychiatric disorder. And as a result, many were critical of Durkheim's assertion that suicide had social causes existing outside the individual. As the criticism mounted, several disagreements emerged. First, Durkheim's theory of suicide was viewed as controversial because it overlooked the individual and focused outside the existing psychological framework within which suicide was understood. Second, in Europe and America, there was a more formal turn to the study of the individual factors of suicide, which led to the ultimate rejection of theories that departed from an analysis of the individual cases. Third, in America, the stress on a psychological approach to suicide meant that the individual was the central subject of investigation. Since many thought that the concept of society was irrelevant to the theory of suicide, statements about the role of society played in the cause of suicide began to disappear at Chicago. And as Philip Besnard points out, even though Chicago was a center of social science in America, they did not mention Durkheim's suicide in their review of sociological work. In France, in addition to America, there were a series of critical attacks focusing on Durkheim's suggestion that the causes of suicide existed outside the individual. The idea that suicide rates are being higher for Catholics as compared to Protestants could also be a false idea, because it could mean that Catholics might have not come forward in claiming that suicide had occurred in the family, as suicide is deemed to be against the wishes of God. Taking one's own life could also mean that there could be a biological reason for it, and something that has been transmitted over generations, and hence the stigma attachment to suicide may have prompted from the more conservative sect cover for such cases if they occurred. To conclude, we can see that Durkheim has sufficiently explained that the suicide rates amongst the Catholics are lesser because they have a much more interrelated and, let us say, a higher level of social control over individual participants, whereas in Protestants this level of control is much lesser. He also explains how and why anomie actually leads to breakdown of human moral, finally leading and pushing an individual into committing suicide. And when this suicide rate is calculated socially for a nation, he calls this a national suicide rate or a community suicide rate. From Durkheim's work, it can be clearly seen that suicide is not a psychological phenomena, but it is very much a social phenomena in which there are external forces which push individuals to commit suicide.